Your history teacher lied to you. They made the past sound like a logical series of events, but we have proof the universe is actually run by a drunk screenwriter. We found 33 moments where the laws of probability just gave up and left the chat. From a sandwich that accidentally triggered a world war to the only two cars in an entire state crashing head-on. If you think these are just accidents, you aren't paying attention. Welcome to the glitch. 1. Back in 1895, the entire state of Ohio was basically one giant empty parking lot because there were exactly two cars in the whole state. Just think about that for a second. Only two mechanical boxes roaming thousands of miles of open road with no traffic lights, no stop signs, and absolutely no congestion. Statistically, these two drivers could have driven around for decades without ever seeing each other. But apparently the universe has a twisted sense of humor, because these two pioneers of the road managed to find each other and crash head-on. It is arguably the most avoidable accident in human history. They essentially invented the car crash before they even invented traffic laws, and I can only imagine how awkward it was explaining to the police that the road was too crowded for the both of them. 2. An Australian truck driver named Bill Morgan might be the only person to literally hack the Matrix. After being crushed by a truck and surviving a 14-minute clinical death, Bill woke up and decided to test his luck with a scratch-off ticket, instantly winning a car worth $17,000. That is already a great story, but the local TV station wanted to film a reenactment for the news. The producer handed Bill another ticket and said, "Just pretend to scratch it so we can get the shot." Bill, being a good sport, scratched the ticket on camera, stopped, and went pale. He didn't act. He turned to the crew and said, "I just won $250,000. The man won the actual jackpot on live TV while pretending to win a jackpot. And that look of shock is something Hollywood actors couldn't replicate in a million years. 3. The assassination that started World War I and changed the entire modern world essentially happened because of a sandwich and a confused driver. After the first attempt on Archduke Franz Ferdinand's life failed that morning, the assassin, Gavrilo Princip, gave up and went to a deli to eat a sandwich. Meanwhile, the Archduke's driver got lost, took a wrong turn, realized his mistake, and tried to reverse. But cars back then were garbage, so the gearbox jammed and the engine stalled. Where did it stall? Exactly 5 feet away from where Princip was finishing his snack. The assassin looked up, saw his target sitting in a stationary car right in front of him like a sitting duck, and fired the shots. If the driver had Google Maps or if Princip wasn't hungry, the entire 20th century would look completely different. 4. In June 2001, a 10-year-old British girl named Laura Buxton released a gold helium balloon with her name and address on it, hoping to find a pen pal. The balloon fought the wind for 140 miles and landed in the backyard of a random house. The homeowners gave it to their neighbor's daughter because, weirdly enough, her name was also Laura Buxton. But this is where the simulation glitches out. The second Laura Buxton was also exactly 10 years old. When the two girls finally met, it turned out they both had the same light brown hair, the same blue eyes, and, this is where it gets scary, they both brought their pets, a 3-year-old black Labrador and a guinea pig. Even their clothes were almost identical. It is like the writers of our reality just copy-pasted a background character to save time. 5. During World War I, the British Navy decided to get clever and disguised their passenger liner, the RMS Carmania, as a specific German ship called the Cap Trafalgar to ambush the enemy. It was a brilliant plan until they actually spotted a ship in the Atlantic that looked suspicious. It turned out to be the real German Cap Trafalgar. But here is the punchline. The German captain had the exact same idea and had disguised his ship as the British Carmania. You literally had a British ship dressed as a German ship fighting a German ship dressed as a British ship. It is basically the Spider-Man pointing meme, but with heavy artillery. They blasted each other while having a total identity crisis until the fake German finally sank the fake Brit, proving that identity theft is a crime even on the high seas. 6. King Richard III vanished from history 500 years ago, and everyone assumed his body was lost forever, likely thrown into a river. That was until 2012, when archaeologists decided to dig up a mundane municipal parking lot in Leicester on a hunch. Incredibly, they found the skeleton of the missing king right there under the asphalt. But the universe decided to add one final layer of irony to the monarch's resting place. The skeleton was found directly beneath a painted letter R on the tarmac. Officially, the R stood for reserved parking, but apparently Destiny decided it stood for Rex, which is Latin for king. The man waited half a millennium to be found, and the whole time he was literally taking up someone's reserved parking spot without a permit. 7. 14 years before the Titanic ever set sail, an author named Morgan Robertson wrote a novella titled Futility that reads less like fiction and more like a time traveler's warning. His book featured a massive British ocean liner named the Titan that everyone called unsinkable. In the story, this ship was filled with rich passengers, didn't have enough lifeboats, hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic on a cold April night, and sank. The details are terrifyingly specific. The size of the ship, the speed, the month, and the cause of the disaster match the real Titanic almost perfectly. Robertson later swore he wasn't a psychic, just a guy who knew maritime trends. But that sounds exactly like what a time traveler who accidentally spoiled a major historical event would say to avoid suspicion. 8. When Ian Fleming was creating the ultimate super spy, he didn't want a cool name. He wanted the dullest, flattest, most masculine name he could find to make the character a blank slate. He looked at his bookshelf, saw a boring field guide called Birds of the West Indies, and read the author's name, James Bond. Fleming thought, "Perfect, that is the most boring name I have ever heard," and stole it. The real James Bond was just a quiet ornithologist who really loved sparrows and pigeons. Suddenly, his life became a nightmare. He was constantly stopped at airport customs by officers thinking he was joking, and women would call his house at midnight looking for a spy. Fleming eventually met the real Bond and gave him a signed book as an apology for accidentally turning his quiet life into a global brand of violence. 9. In June 1941, Soviet anthropologists led by Mikhail Gerasimov traveled to Uzbekistan to open the tomb of the brutal warlord Tamerlane, but they were met with terrified locals screaming about a deadly curse. The tomb allegedly bore an inscription that read, "Who opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I," which is exactly the kind of warning you should probably listen to in a horror movie. Gerasimov, a man of science who didn't care about ancient superstitions, popped the lid open anyway on June 20th. Exactly 2 days later, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, devastating the Soviet Union. The timing was so suspiciously perfect that even Joseph Stalin eventually panicked. He ordered Tamerlane's remains to be reburied with full Islamic rites in late 1942. Here is the wildest part. Mere days after the tomb was resealed, the Soviets won the Battle of Stalingrad, turning the tide of the entire war. Coincidence? Maybe, but I wouldn't bet my life on it. 10. On March 12, 1951, the universe decided to pull a massive prank on copyright lawyers by launching 2 identical comic strips on opposite sides of the ocean at the exact same moment. In the UK, a comic debuted featuring a messy-haired, mischievous boy in a striped shirt named Dennis the Menace. Simultaneously, in the United States, a completely different cartoonist released a strip about a messy-haired, mischievous boy in a striped shirt, also named Dennis the Menace. There was no internet, no leaks, and no way for these creators to communicate across the Atlantic. It was just a bizarre case of collective consciousness glitching out. This resulted in decades of legal confusion, where the British Dennis is a rude bully, and the American Dennis is just a slightly annoying kid. Yet they have coexisted for over 70 years like long-lost twins from parallel dimensions who refuse to acknowledge each other. 11. If you ever feel like the universe is out to get you, just remember the story of Major Walter Summerford, the man whom Mother Nature personally hated. During World War I, he was riding his horse in Belgium when a bolt of lightning struck him, knocking him off his mount and paralyzing his legs. He survived, moved to Canada to live a quiet life, and went fishing. While he was sitting by a river, lightning struck the tree above him and paralyzed the entire right side of his body. Amazingly, he recovered again, only to be walking in a park 2 years later when lightning struck him a third time, paralyzing him completely. He eventually died, presumably thinking he was finally safe from the sky's wrath. He was wrong. 4 years after his funeral, a storm rolled in, and a bolt of lightning struck his gravestone, shattering it to pieces. That is not just bad luck. That is a personal vendetta by Zeus himself. 12. In 1913, Vienna was the glittering cultural capital of the world, but it was also serving as a terrifying incubator for the 20th century's worst nightmares. During that one specific year, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, Josip Tito, and Sigmund Freud all lived in central Vienna, all within a few square miles of each other. They frequented the same parks and drank at the same trendy cafes. It is mind-blowing to imagine that the future architect of the Holocaust and the future dictator of the Soviet Union could have literally bumped into each other while waiting for a cappuccino, or that Trotsky might have sat next to Freud and complained about his dreams. You had the future architects of global destruction and modern psychology all breathing the same air, totally unaware that they were about to tear the world apart in very different ways. 13. The legendary cyberpunk video game Deus Ex, released in the year 2000, is famous for its gameplay, but it is infamous for an accidental prediction that is genuinely unsettling. Due to severe memory limitations on the gaming computers of the time, the developers couldn't render the entire complex New York City skyline. To save texture memory, they simply deleted the Twin Towers from the background. To explain why the towers were missing in the game's story, they added a throwaway line of dialogue stating that they had been destroyed by a terrorist attack. The game was released just 1 year before the actual 9/11 attacks happened. It wasn't a political statement or a warning. It was just a technical shortcut to save RAM that accidentally predicted the biggest tragedy of the modern era with terrifying accuracy. 14. Charles Coughlin was a famous 19th century actor who died in Galveston, Texas, but his dying wish was to be buried near his home on Prince Edward Island in Canada, which was over 3,000 miles away. Unfortunately, shipping a body that far was too expensive, so his family buried him in a cemetery in Texas. A year later, the Great Galveston Hurricane hit, destroying the coast and washing the entire cemetery into the ocean. Coughlin's coffin drifted out to sea, caught the Gulf Stream, floated around the tip of Florida, and traveled all the way up the Atlantic coast. A year after that, some fishermen on Prince Edward Island found a barnacle-covered coffin washing ashore near their boat. It was Charles Coughlin. He had drifted 3,000 miles and landed essentially in his own front yard. The man literally managed to get himself home for free, posthumously, proving that even death couldn't stop him from saving on shipping costs. 15. We all know the tragic story of John Wilkes Booth assassinating Abraham Lincoln, but history conveniently forgot the incredible plot twist involving his brother. A few months before the assassination, Lincoln's eldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was waiting on a crowded train platform in New Jersey. The crowd pressed forward, and Robert slipped, falling into the gap between the platform and a moving train, facing certain death. Suddenly, a hand reached out and pulled him to safety by his collar. Robert turned to thank his hero and recognized him immediately. It was Edwin Booth, the most famous actor of the era and the brother of the man who would soon murder his father. It is a staggering irony. The good brother saved a Lincoln, while the bad brother killed a Lincoln. It plays out like a Shakespearean tragedy written by a screenwriter who had too much to drink. 16. The Menai Strait in Wales seems to have a very specific, glitchy rule regarding shipwrecks. If you want to survive, you better be named Hugh Williams. On December 5, 1664, a ship sank in the strait, and all 80 passengers died except for one man named Hugh Williams. Fast forward over a century to December 5, 1785, and another ship sank nearby with 60 passengers. The only survivor was a man named Hugh Williams. In 1820, on a different date, a third ship went down, and guess who the sole survivor was? A guy named Hugh Williams. Legend even says that in 1940, A mine destroyed a ship there, and the only two survivors were a man and his nephew, both named Hugh Williams. Either this guy is an immortal traveler, or Hugh Williams is the cheat code for surviving drowning in Wales, and nobody else got the memo. 17. In the weeks leading up to the D-Day invasion in 1944, British intelligence MI5 nearly had a collective heart attack because of a simple crossword puzzle. The Daily Telegraph began publishing puzzles that contained the top-secret code names for the operation as answers. We are talking about highly classified words like Omaha, Utah, Overlord, Neptune, and Mulberry appearing consecutively in the days before the attack. MI5 was convinced that the puzzle creator, a schoolteacher named Leonard Daw, was a deep-cover Nazi spy signaling the enemy. They raided his home and grilled him for hours, only to discover the most anticlimactic truth imaginable. Daw had simply asked his students to suggest cool words for the puzzle, and the kids had overheard soldiers chatting near their school. It wasn't espionage, it was just loose-lipped soldiers and a schoolteacher with terrible timing. 18. November 22nd, 1963 is universally remembered as the tragic day President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. But it was arguably the single worst day in history to be a dying celebrity. On that exact same day, mere hours apart, two literary giants also passed away. C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, and Aldous Huxley, the visionary behind Brave New World. Under any other circumstances, the death of either of these men would have been front-page news across the globe, sparking weeks of tributes. Instead, their deaths were completely buried by the Kennedy coverage, relegated to tiny footnotes on page 10 of the newspapers. It was a bizarre cosmic coincidence where three world-changing visionaries checked out of reality at the same time, but only one got the headline. 19. In July 1900, King Umberto III of Italy went to a small restaurant in Monza and experienced a glitch in the matrix that would make anyone paranoid. The king noticed that the restaurant owner looked exactly like him. Physically, they were identical twins. Intrigued, the king started asking questions and the answers got terrifying. The owner was also named Umberto. They were both born on the exact same day in the same town. They both married a woman named Margarita. The owner opened his restaurant on the same day the king was crowned. The king was understandably freaked out, but the universe wasn't done yet. The very next day, the owner was shot and killed in a mysterious accident. A few hours later, King Umberto was assassinated by an anarchist. The universe apparently reused the same character model and deleted them both in the same patch update. 20. The construction of the Hoover Dam was a massive, dangerous engineering project that claimed 112 lives. But the first and last deaths are connected by a coincidence that is almost too scripted to believe. The very first person to die during the initial surveys was a man named George Tierney, who drowned on December 20, 1922. Fast forward 13 years of brutal construction work to the very end of the project. The final person to die on the job fell from an intake tower on December 20, 1935. That man was Patrick Tierney, George's son. Not only did they die on the exact same day of the year, but they were the chaotic bookends of the entire project. The father started the tragedy, and the son finished it. It is a heartbreaking statistical anomaly that links one family to the dam forever. 21. Wilmer McLean is arguably the most frustrated man in American history because the Civil War literally followed him around like a stray dog. The first major land battle of the war, the First Battle of Bull Run, broke out specifically on his farm in 1861. A cannonball even dropped through his chimney and landed in his stew. McLean decided he wanted no part of this madness, so he packed up his family and moved 120 miles south to a quiet town called Appomattox, thinking he would be safe. 4 years later, in 1865, Robert E. Lee needed a place to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant. A messenger knocked on the nearest nice house, which happened to be Wilmer McLean's new home. The war started in his backyard and ended in his front parlor. The man moved to escape the war, only to have the entire war invite itself over for tea. 22. Stephen Hawking was a man who unraveled the mysteries of the universe. so it is only fitting that the universe used his life to show off its mathematical precision. Hawking was born on January 8, 1942, which happened to be the 300th anniversary of the death of Galileo Galilei, the father of modern science. That is already a cool party fact, but the universe wasn't finished. Hawking passed away on March 14, 2018. That date is the birthday of Albert Einstein. Oh, and March 14 is also celebrated globally as Pi Day, 314. So the man's existence was perfectly bracketed by Galileo, Einstein, and the most famous number in mathematics. It is almost as if the cosmos wanted to make sure we knew that Hawking was part of the official scientific lineage, signed, sealed, and delivered by destiny. 23. In 1858, in the lawless Wild West town of San Francisco, a man named Robert Fallon was playing high-stakes poker. He got incredibly lucky and won a massive pot of gold, but was immediately accused of cheating by his angry opponents, who shot him dead right at the table. The superstitious gamblers considered the $600 pot to be cursed blood money and refused to take it. They called in the first stranger they saw on the street to take Fallon's seat and play out the hand. The stranger sat down, played aggressively, and turned the $600 into $2,200, a fortune back then. When the police arrived to investigate the shooting, they asked the stranger for his name. It turned out he was Fallon's son, who hadn't seen his father in 7 years. The universe apparently decided that the money was staying in the family, one way or another. 24. If you love patterns, the link between Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler will absolutely wreck your brain, centered entirely around the number 129. Napoleon came to power in 1804. Hitler came to power 129 years later in 1933. Napoleon invaded Vienna in 1809. Hitler invaded Vienna, the Anschluss, 129 years later in 1938. Napoleon launched his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. Hitler launched his disastrous invasion of Russia 129 years later in 1941. And finally, Napoleon was defeated and lost his empire in 1815. Hitler was defeated and lost his empire roughly 129 years later in 1944-45. It is as if history was running on a loop and simply forgot to change the script, proving that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it on a strict mathematical schedule. 25. Robert Todd Lincoln might be the single biggest jinx in American political history, to the point where he really should have been banned from all public events for national security reasons. Obviously, he was at the bedside of his father, Abraham Lincoln, right after the assassination in 1865. That is tragic enough, but the universe was just getting started. In 1881, Robert was standing on a train platform with President James Garfield when Garfield was shot by an assassin. 20 years later, in 1901, he was invited to the Pan American Exposition by President William McKinley. And, you guessed it, McKinley was assassinated while Robert was just nearby. After that third tragedy, Robert famously refused a later invitation to the White House, reportedly stating, "No, I'm not going, and they'd better not ask me, because there is a certain fatality about presidential functions when I am present." The man realized he was a walking game-over screen for presidents and wisely removed himself from the equation. 26. The Mongol Empire conquered almost everything in its path, but when Kublai Khan tried to invade Japan, Mother Nature personally stepped in to slap him in the face not once, but twice. In 1274, the Mongols launched a massive fleet to conquer the islands, but a sudden, devastating typhoon wiped out their ships before they could gain a foothold. Kublai Khan, refusing to take a hint from the universe, spent 7 years building an even bigger fleet, the largest armada the world had ever seen, and tried again in 1281. Incredibly, a second massive typhoon hit at the exact moment of the invasion, destroying the fleet again. The odds of 2 specific storms hitting the same spot during 2 specific invasions are non-existent. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, or divine wind, convinced the gods were protecting them, while the Mongols just accepted that the weather forecast was clearly rigged against them. 27. If you look at the entire timeline of ancient Rome, it feels like the writers just got lazy and decided to reuse the same names to close the loop perfectly. According to legend, the great city was founded in 753 BC by its first king, Romulus, who killed his brother Remus to get the job done. Fast forward over 1,000 years of glory, conquests, and togas to the very bitter end of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. The last emperor, a teenager who surrendered the crown to invading barbarians, was named Romulus Augustulus. The empire started with a Romulus and ended with a Romulus. It is the historical equivalent of ending a sentence with the exact same word you started it with. The universe opened the Rome file, ran the simulation for a millennium, and then closed it with the exact same file name. 28. The sleepy town of Erdington in England is home to a murder mystery that suggests time is actually a broken record skipping on a beat. On May 27, 1817, a young woman named Mary Ashford was found murdered in Pitts Park. She had been at a dance the night before, left to meet a friend, and was killed. A man named Thornton was accused, but eventually acquitted. Now, fast forward exactly 157 years to May 27, 1974. Another young woman, Barbara Forrest, was found murdered in the exact same park. She had also been at a dance, left to meet a friend, and was killed in the same manner. The main suspect in her case was a man with the last name Thornton, who was also acquitted. It is the same crime, the same date, the same location, and the same suspect name, just separated by a century and a half. It is a copy-paste error in reality that no detective can explain. 29. In 1840, William Henry Harrison was elected President of the U.S., but he died a month later, allegedly triggering the Curse of Tippecanoe, or the Zero-Year Curse. Supposedly set by the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, the curse stated that every president elected in a year ending in Zerfro would die in office. For 120 years, it worked with terrifying precision. Harrison, 1840, died. Lincoln, 1860, was assassinated. Garfield, 1880, was assassinated. McKinley, 1900, was assassinated. Harding, 1920, died of a heart attack. FDR, 1940, died of a stroke. Kennedy, 1960, was assassinated. The pattern was absolute law until Ronald Reagan, 1980, came along. He was shot in the chest, but somehow survived, apparently breaking the curse through sheer Hollywood resilience. The streak was finally over, but for over a century, winning an election in a 0 year was basically a guaranteed death sentence. 30. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were the frenemies of the American Revolution. They built the country together, fought each other in politics, and then became pen pals in old age. But their final act was a coordinated stunt that no PR team could ever pull off. Both men died on July 4, 1826. This wasn't just any July 4th, it was the exact 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a document they both helped write. Adams' last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives," which was awkward because Jefferson had actually died 5 hours earlier in Virginia. These two founding fathers literally held on to life just long enough to die on their country's golden birthday, proving that they were patriotic showmen to the very bitter end. 31. King Louis Xaphres of France was once warned by an astrologer to be terrified of the 21st day of the month, and looking back, he really should have stayed in bed on those days. On June 21, 1791, the king and queen tried to escape the French Revolution in the flight to Varennes, but they were caught and arrested, marking the beginning of the end. On September 21, 1792, the French monarchy was officially abolished, and France became a republic, stripping him of his title. Finally, on January 21, 1793, Louis was dragged to the guillotine and executed. The number 21 was there for his arrest, his deposition, and his death. It is almost as if the universe had a calendar alert set to ruin this man's life on the exact same day of the month 3 separate times until the job was finished. 32. Mark Twain was not just a brilliant writer. He was apparently a celestial travel agent who booked his own departure from Earth. He was born in 1835, exactly 2 weeks after Halley's Comet was visible in the sky. In 1909, knowing the comet was due to return the next year, Twain famously said, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it." He joked that the Almighty had said, "Here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, they must go out together." True to his word, Twain died of a heart attack on April 21st, 1910, exactly one day after the comet reached its brightest point in the night sky. He essentially hitched a ride on a passing space rock, proving his timing was as impeccable as his wit. 33. World War I was a meat grinder that chewed up millions of men across vast muddy battlefields, so the odds of any specific burial arrangement are basically zero. But in the Saint Symphorien Military Cemetery in Belgium, you will find the grave of Private John Parr, the very first British soldier killed in the war in August 1914. Now, walk just a few yards away, and you will find the grave of Private George Ellison, the very last British soldier killed in the war, who died just 90 minutes before the armistice in November 1918. Here is the part that will give you goosebumps. Their graves are facing each other, merely 15 feet apart. This wasn't a poetic decision by the government or a symbolic gesture by architects. It was a complete accident of logistics. The cemetery simply filled up that way over 4 years. The Alpha and the Omega of the war are staring at each other for eternity, closing the tragic loop of the conflict by pure, random chance. That was 33 glitches in the Matrix, but I know for a fact I missed the biggest one. There is always that one famous, mind-bending historical coincidence that everyone screams about, and I deliberately left it out just to see if you would notice. Do you know which one it is, or do you have a personal story that beats these? Call me out in the comments right now. Also, hit subscribe, unless you want your next lottery ticket to be a blank piece of paper. Don't risk it.